Hello everyone, thanks for being here today. Yes, as Jonathan mentioned, my presentation is entitled Analysis Through Performer Interpretations of Open Graphic Notation. Although the 1950s to the late 1970s is generally considered to be the golden age of graphic notation in Western art music, organ music, eye music, and other forms of graphic notation can be traced back to the 14th century. From Western medieval vocal music with Bod Cordier's infamous heart-shaped score to 19th century Eastern Tibetan Yan-Yig chant notation, which represents the music's melodies, rhythmic patterns, and instrumental arrangements during ritual performances. Although graphic notation has existed in various forms since the dawn of music notation, in the West, the terms graphic score and graphic notation have come to define the notational practices of experimental composers in the 20th century who used graphic notation to convey information that could not be realized with traditional music notation. During the mid-20th century, Western composers began to revisit graphic notation by creating new and exciting visual scores. John Cage and the New York School were some of the earliest proponents of the mid-20th century graphic notation renaissance, with Earl Brown's December 1952 often being cited as one of the earliest examples of graphic notation in the West. Both examples here could be considered open graphic scores, and the term open relates to Umberto Eco's definition of open works as compositions that employ music notation that is intentionally ambiguous. Although Cage coined the term indeterminacy, its actual practice is very similar and sometimes synonymous with improvisation happening in much jazz music of the time. It is worth noting that Anthony Braxton, who occupies a place within jazz, Western contemporary concert music, and the practice of graphic notation, states that, quote, "Both aleatory and indeterminism are words that have been coined to bypass the word improvisation and as such the influence of non-white sensibility," end quote. Braxton's comment succinctly contextualizes the social situation of 20th century Western experimental practices of graphic notation and the relationship between the jazz improvisation community and the concert music community. Graphic notation takes many forms, from specific pictograms that create sophisticated hieroglyphic systems where symbols have a one-to-one relationship to techniques and or gestures, to more abstract open graphic scores where no instructions are given. And these are examples of sound classifications from one of Braxton's volumes of his composition notes. Although these gestures have a one-to-one relationship with their discrete techniques, there is still room for performer freedom and improvisation, which is often the case with these types of graphic score systems. Braxton developed his graphic system based on his tricentric philosophies so that he could maintain form and autonomy in his compositions without dissolving into complete free improvisation. Braxton's extensive symbol list brings up the idea of semantic soundness, which is discussed by Cat Hope, Lindsay Vickery, and Stuart James in a recent article where they say, quote, "One important factor contributing to the efficacy of graphic notation is semantic soundness, the degree to which the graphical representation makes intuitive sense to the reader, rather than necessitating learning and memorization of new symbols." And these extensive symbol lists and legend, combined with Braxton's very convoluted tricentric philosophies, brings up the idea of the amount that you have to learn in order to be able to engage with his graphic score systems. So perhaps a less daunting example is Robert Moran's 4 Visions for Flute, Harp, and String Quartet from 1963. And again, we have a legend that is clearly defined, but there's still room for freedom, improvisation, and interaction. The legend's a little smaller, and he groups some instruments and techniques together. For example, in that second pictogram, that represents flutter tongue for flute and tremolo for strings. One of the main differences between Moran and Braxton is that Braxton's graphic systems are almost always in the context of Western stats and systems, whereas Moran transcends this by creating an abstract graphic score that can be read both right to left and left to right. If Braxton and Moran are on one side of the spectrum, on the other side of the spectrum we would find more abstract graphic scores, like Mark Applebaum's The Metaphysics of Notation or Cornelius Cardew's Treatise. Open graphic scores such as these differ from Braxton or Moran in that there are no instructions given on how to perform the works. After much pleading from the publication company, Cornelius Cardew retroactively wrote a handbook to accompany his graphic score treatise, and Mark Applebaum followed in his footsteps some 35 years later. Both Cardew and Applebaum used these handbooks to illustrate their compositional philosophies and reasoning for creating these scores, but refrain from giving any prescriptive instructions, and only Cardew offers a few descriptions of past performances. However, Cardew did speak of his desire for the piece to be performed by musical innocents, saying that visual artists and non-musicians would have an easier time interpreting the notation as opposed to someone who had been educated in traditional Western music. Applebaum shows how his graphic symbols can function in ways that are analogous to fundamental compositional conventions. He does this by illustrating how the form and patterns created in the metaphysics of notation connotes qualities that are common in all music. So this lecture recital is based around a web-based open graphic research project that I recently launched. This research project will allow me to gather multiple interpretations of the same 4 open graphic scores that I can then study and analyze. Each interpreter-performer is asked to complete a questionnaire after the performance, and this will act as a subjective interpretation to be used as the starting point for analysis. Performers' subjective interpretations of open graphic notation is the ideal starting point for analysis because it contextualizes the semantic soundness of the graphic notation. My research project is centered around 3 main research questions. First, how and why are graphic and other alternative notation techniques becoming the preferred method for musicians communicating written music online? In the 21st century, digital technology like streaming services and online libraries allow for the rapid dissemination of music and scores around the world. However, despite the ubiquity of traditional Western scores and music, a rethinking of music notation's accessibility and its role in supporting contemporary digital practice is still needed. Second, how do graphic scores' accessibility support multiple correct interpretations when performed by artists from diverse musical styles and backgrounds? Here, accessibility refers to how graphic notation allows performers from different musical backgrounds to be able to play from the same score together, whether they be traditional Western music notation readers, improvisers who play with and without notation, and non-music reading musicians. And finally, how, if at all, do graphic scores retain any perceptible aural identity from one performance to the next? Although Virginia Anderson has successfully illustrated how Earl Brown's 4 systems can retain a distinct aural identity over subsequent performances, more complex graphic scores, like Applebaum's The Metaphysics of Notation, are often considered to be incompatible with analysis because they support endless correct interpretations. These research questions and my open graphic score research project will help to increase notational accessibility by encouraging collaboration between artists and musicians from different musical and artistic backgrounds. Cat Hope states that graphic and animated notation utilize current contemporary digital technologies, making notation accessible and more easy to share, but more importantly, offer the possibility of a collaborative, democratic, and world-encompassing approach to music notation that could bring together musicians from different styles, empowering the musical praxis for both performers and audiences. Composers such as Mark Applebaum and Lars Brondum discuss musical decisions with performers in rehearsal and post-performance to illustrate how their subjective interpretations act as the basis for analyzing the graphic symbols. For example, Applebaum explains how a performer became frustrated and did not know what to do when interpreting a pictograph of an airplane in the metaphysics of notation, and decided to take flight and move to a different section of the score to search for new inspiration. Applebaum describes the performer's choice as a perfectly appropriate interpretation of his piece. Brondum takes this a step further by interviewing and questioning performers to gather the specifics of how the graphic notation informed their playing and vice versa. I plan to further develop analysis by utilizing aspects of Lasse Thorson's oral sonology system of musical analysis. But for today, I will be using the performer interview Q&A methodology to explore how the concerns, choices, and pursuits of music performance inform the practice of music analysis and vice versa. I'm going to have 2 performers come up here and play 4-minute interpretations of my score, study in open graphic notation number 2 on piano. And to keep performances authentic, I'm going to ask Vivian to step outside into the back, please, and Jasmine to come up onto the stage, and yeah, we'll get going with these interpretations. invite Vivian to come in now and play her interpretation. Fantastic. That was the first time we've all heard these interpretations, so I'm just as excited as everyone else. Okay, so now we're going to start the question and answer period. Should I bring this microphone over?
I wonder if you can use this one.
Okay.
Pass it around. That's probably the easiest thing to do.
Great job. So yeah, first question. What is your musical background and how much experience do you have with graphic notation and playing the piano?
Okay, so I am actually a percussion major currently, but I have about maybe 11 years of experience on piano, so that was the earlier part of my life. There's a transition over to percussion. Percussion is around 12 years of experience. And so that's mainly what I do now, but I have been interested in contemporary music and graphic notation for around the last 5 to 6 years.
So, hi everyone, my name is Vivian, and I'm a piano performance student here at UT. I have been playing the piano for 13 years, and I do a little bit of composition, and so with graphic notation, this is the first one that I actually did. That's full graphic notation. I have done some pieces in the past where there are graphic elements, but it's not the entire piece.
And that segues into the next question. So do you prefer to read graphic notation in your limited experience unit, or do you prefer to read Western music notation, no notation at all? What is your preference for notation?
So personally, of course it depends on the piece and what we're trying to get across. Like let's say if you're going back to Beethoven and Chopin, of course you need to go from the score. So I don't have a very strong opinion on whether I prefer very precise notated notes versus graphic notation. But when the composer is looking for something that's larger than life, a certain gesture that just can't be translated through like standard notation, I think in that case I would prefer graphic.
So I think out of the two, I do prefer reading graphic notation more, but that's just due to the sort of scenarios I find myself in as a percussionist. So I think Western notation is great for like establishing the foundation of knowing like, okay, it goes from piano to forte, I should work on my crescendos, and to work on rhythm and all sort of that stuff. So it's sort of like, I think of it as a roof, and that you can work anything from the ground up to that roof. But then graphic notation allows for that exploration beyond and different interpretations. Like for Western notation, you can't look at a group of 16th notes and be like, I wonder what those could represent, because it's going to be 16th notes. But especially for graphic notation, and oh, the score's gone. Looking at the score, it's like you can interpret more as maybe like a visual artist. Like you can see the notation and see what does that sort of invoke in yourself. So I think it allows for a lot of creative exploration beyond just following the score and making sure that the score is impeccable every time you play it.
Describe your path through the score. What gestures, techniques, sounds, formal considerations, etc. correspond to what graphic symbols and why?
Can we go first?
Oh, you can go first.
Okay. So I set up, I keep on looking back, but the score's not there. But so looking at the score, I set up some of my own constraints. So with the dots that were at the beginning, I was thinking, maybe if all the dots are black, I would play them on black notes only. And so as the dots travel downwards and become larger, I thought of these clusters of notes becoming bigger, wider clusters, and then with the transitions of the sort of string scraping in between, I thought it would be like a nice sort of like following through the score in a very literal sense. And so as the dots get bigger and you see these little white streaky lines, these cracks in there, I thought I could play those interjections on the white keys as the black notes are sustaining. And as we build more, I tried to do bigger clusters of notes, longer clusters, more interjections, sort of like the fragmentation of the white notes within. And leading up to the last, like, very large circle, I thought, okay, so it's no longer maybe a cluster of black notes behind these white interjections. It's more like, I guess I played all the huge cluster on the white notes instead, and I allowed the black notes to be the sort of little, sort of like spices on top, and just like sprinkling them throughout, dotting them. And that is pretty much how I work my way through the score.
Yeah, thank you. For me, I made a couple of markers on the score for myself, including where the timestamps are, because we do have a time limit, and I think depending on how much time we're given, the piece will be totally different, because there are so many possibilities on the piano, let's say. So first thing I did was, mark down the timestamps. At what time? What do I want to do? So for me, what stood out was there are two very distinct elements on this notation. There are, the dots, or it became like huge balls, and then there are the lines that connect them in between. So I want to make that distinction between these two gestures. And so I use the keys to represent like the balls of, whatever. And then the lines are represented by, brushing against the strings, just to get more variety in sound on the piano. And then as we kind of build, I also read from left to right. I think that makes a huge difference if people approach from right to left. So the smaller dots, I started in a more, the lowest registers, I started off with single notes, and then maybe small clusters, then slowly wiggling more individual notes and passages in there. And then as we get to like the bigger balls, I say, the lines in there get more dense as well, so I kind of weaved in more individual movement instead of just, single note or single cluster. And then I also expanded the whole register on the keyboard as well.
All right, and then just last question, how has this experience changed or influenced how you think about interpretation, performance, and analysis?
I think taking the time to really dive into a graphic score can be really fulfilling, because I think often in my experiences, sometimes we're just improvising together, throw a graphic score, and in the large ensemble, it's like, okay, sort of follow through and play. But with this experience and for this situation in particular, really looking at the score and checking, it's like, how could I interpret it? And it's just thinking deeply and thinking, I don't know, like creatively, because even you could look at each of those circles and treat that as a graphic score in itself. So if you just hone in on that, you can think, what would the texture be like inside this? So you can think of graphic scores within graphic scores, or even just in terms of texture, I said it was like crackling, but I think there was one point where I looked at it and I was like, it sort of looks like lightning. So how would lightning sound in this sort of situation? I think I stuck with like the more crackly stuff, but it's been really fulfilling. I've really enjoyed hearing your interpretation too. It's just really cool seeing the score be interpreted by different people.
Yeah, for me, again, this is my first time actually doing a full-on graphic score. So one of the biggest questions that I pondered or asked myself was, how much of the score do I want to interpret, do I want to translate to the audience? And do I want to have a narrative for this picture? Or do I just want to abstractly make some kind of sound happen? And so I heard some descriptive words from Jasmine that you're kind of thinking about some sort of narrative. For me, it's more just kind of conveying the feeling of maybe something getting closer, a growing sense of, something approaching, or a sound just growing, ever expanding. So I went down the more abstract route with this.
Fantastic. Well, that's the end of the questions. Thank you so much for both your performances, and let's give them another round of applause. Okay. performers' subjective interpretations of open abstract graphic notation is the ideal starting point for analysis because, as we can see, it contextualizes the semantic soundness of the graphic notation. For myself, graphic notation allows performers to actively participate in the compositional process, but at the same time, a certain type of auteur can be retained through the creation of a score. This can be seen with Anthony Braxton and Earl Brown, whose graphic systems allow their compositions to maintain form and autonomy, without dissolving into complete free improvisation. I maintain that through personal aesthetic and critical concern of form, more open abstract graphic notation like Applebaum's and Cardoo's can maintain this specific type of auteur. My research and analysis through performer interpretation will further explore music analysis and the relationship between composers, performers, and music theorists. More importantly, this practice-based research will explore how graphic notation's multiplicity of interpretations creates a musical situation that is more accessible and democratic than traditional Western music notation. My research will therefore increase notational accessibility by encouraging collaboration between artists and musicians from different backgrounds. I will continue to conduct my research in a web-based format to make the research and materials more widely available to the public. To develop open graphic score analysis further, I plan on using aspects of Lasse Thorson's oral sonology analysis system. The oral sonology approach is a method of analysis and theory that is not uniquely reserved for a particular compositional style or expression, as it analyzes the sonic and structural aspects of music as heard. This approach is particularly useful for dealing with music for which no score is available, electroacoustic music, or instrumental music for which there is no simple one-to-one correspondence between score and aural phenomenon, i.e. open graphic scores. The performer's subjective answers, together with the more objective oral sonology system of analysis, will ideally create a new comprehensive method of analysis for open graphic scores. I plan to use interpretations, such as Jasmine and Vivian's, as material for future compositions and research creation projects. This process could create a type of reinterpretation feedback loop that could connect people from different artistic practices and create a situation where novices can interact and influence professionals. For example, a hobby electric guitarist who has no formal music training could produce a noisy, distorted interpretation of one of these open graphic scores that could be analyzed with software to create a spectrogram, to be translated and reinterpreted into Western music notation that could be played by an orchestra, for example. Although composers such as James O'Callahan and Peter Ablinger reinterpret soundscapes by translating them into Western notation, and composer Josh Biggs turns open graphic score interpretations into acousmatic works, reinterpretation of original graphic score interpretations into traditional Western notation is a relatively unexplored area of 21st century composition. And if you want to participate, you can come chat with me or visit my website if you want to be a part of the project. I'd like to thank Jasmine and Vivian for their fantastic performances, Ben and Ayun and everyone who helped out make this symposium possible, my advisor Elliot Britton, and bibliography. There we go.